Hello students, this is the lesson video for lesson 2.12 and we'll be going over simple carbohydrates. So here's a general overview about lesson 2.12. We're going to go over what simple carbohydrates are. We'll be going over two different classes. One are monosaccharides, the other are disaccharides. And some examples of each one would be glucose, fructose, and galactose. And some examples of disaccharides would be sucrose and lactose. So the goals for this lesson is that you would know that carbohydrates contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. You'll be able to explain why carbohydrates function so well as chemical energy. So that's a key point. Carbohydrates are a source of energy. And the reason why is because they are easily broken down into compounds that result in the formation of usable energy that we will call ATP in later lessons. And lastly, you'll be able to recognize that simple carbohydrates are made up of either one or two sugar molecules. So carbohydrates are organic compounds. Remember, we talked about organic compounds as compounds that are made up of carbon and are necessary for life. Okay, so carbohydrates fall into that category, and they are made from not only carbon but also hydrogen and oxygen. Carbohydrates are a class of organic compounds that are made exclusively from those elements. The atoms are in a general ratio of 1 to 2 to 1, which means that there are, for every one carbon, there are 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. Okay, so that means that there are an equal number of carbon and oxygen, right? And twice as many hydrogens in every single carbohydrate. So carbohydrates, you can see, are even found in things like carrots, and this is the chemical structure of a carbohydrate. So the building blocks of carbohydrates are single sugar molecules or monosaccharides. And an easy way to remember what monosaccharides means is mono means one, and saccharides actually means sugar. So together it means one sugar. On the right is an example of the chemical structure of a glucose molecule. Glucose is a really important sugar molecule that we'll be talking about a little bit more later on. Single sugars, like glucose, usually have around 5 or 6 carbon atoms that are found in some sort of ring structure like this. The chemical formula for this monosaccharide, glucose, would be C6, which means it has 6 carbons, H12, which means it has 12 hydrogen, and O6, which means that it has 6 oxygen. So again, you see that there is the same amount of carbon and oxygen and double the amount of hydrogen. To draw that sugar ring that you see right here, scientists often use shapes such as pentagons and hexagons, depending on how many carbons are present in the sugar. At the corner of the shape, so like right here and right here, there is a carbon atom. But since there's so many carbons that are present in a sugar, a shorthand of drawing a carbon is just to put the two lines together and form a corner, and you would know that a carbon actually exists there. So the main thing that you need to know about carbohydrates or simple carbohydrates is that they're used as a source of energy. Okay, so living things use carbohydrates, specifically the monosaccharide glucose, remember mono means one, as a source of chemical energy. So basically, because glucose is found in many plants and animals, after ingesting them in various forms, so it could be eating grass or it could be eating different types of foods, living things digest and break down the carbohydrates through a series of chemical reactions. So we have living things eating carbohydrates, and then that carbohydrate gets broken down further. So an example would be a cow might eat grass, a hawk might eat a mouse, a bacterium might decompose part of a dead mouse. All of these are examples of food being broken down into glucose, which is a monosaccharide that provides chemical energy for the living thing. So again, you eat something and it gets broken down into glucose, and we can use that glucose to make energy. So this lesson we're talking about simple carbohydrates, but basically what you need to know about simple carbohydrates and how it relates to complex carbohydrates is that you put simple carbohydrates put them together to make complex carbohydrates. And some of these complex carbohydrates are used by plants in order to make its structure. Okay, so let's look at glucose a little bit more closely. Glucose is the main carbohydrate that is converted into energy by living things. So again, glucose is the main carbohydrate that is used for energy. The monosaccharide glucose is central to all living things. So it has a chemical formula that we talked about, C6H12O6, and it exists in two different structural forms, which you can see here, a boat structure as well as a chair structure. So far we've learned that carbohydrates are broken down to generate energy. So organisms will eat, and then the carbohydrates will be broken down, usually into glucose, and we would use that glucose to make energy. In fact, a body actually can convert carbohydrates, fats, as well as proteins into glucose, so usable energy, which we'll learn later on is ATP, can be produced. So whenever we talk about the word food, or that an animal eats food, etc., it's mostly we're talking about that they're consuming glucose. Another type of monosaccharide besides glucose, right, is called fructose. And a really easy way to remember what fructose is it starts with an FRU, and fructose is actually found in fruits. Okay, so fructose actually has the same chemical formula as glucose, so it has that C6H12O6, the same chemical formula, but it exists in a different structural form. A simple difference in structure actually makes fructose and glucose very different. However, after it's ingested, so after we eat, for example, an apple or any fruit that has fructose in it, fructose is actually converted back into glucose so that we can use it for energy generating reactions. So fructose needs to be converted to glucose, whereas if we just ingested glucose, we could just use that glucose as energy. Other types of monosaccharides, which remember means one sugar molecule, are deoxyribose and ribose. So these are two different types of sugar that are found in DNA and RNA, which are examples of nucleic acids. Okay, so DNA and RNA are obviously very important because they are the genetic material that we have in our cells. And deoxyribose and ribose are a key component in the nucleic acid structures. Both of these monosaccharides actually have 5 carbon atoms, right? So that's unique of the ribose and deoxyribose. Nucleic acids are the molecules that contain and implement genetic control because they make up DNA and RNA. DNA contains instructions for building proteins, that's obviously very important, and RNA is really important in making the proteins. Okay, so DNA has the instructions, RNA is what we use to actually make these proteins. And monosaccharides, you can see how important they are now because they are an essential part of both DNA and RNA. You could even count the number of carbons. This is an example of deoxyribose, which is found in DNA. You could remember every corner, like right here, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, and it has one more right here, which would be 5. 5 carbons in this deoxyribose. Okay, so all of the different examples that we just talked about were examples of monosaccharides. Mono meaning one, saccharide meaning sugar. Now we're going to go ahead and take a look at a disaccharide called sucrose. So di means two, and saccharide still means sugar. So now what we're going to be looking at are simple sugars that are made up of 2 sugar molecules. So sucrose is an example of this, and this is when 2 monosaccharides, so 2 single sugar molecules, form a chemical bond with one another, which you can see right here. Right? We see that we have 2 sugar molecules, 1, 2, forming a chemical bond that link them together. So sucrose is the chemical name for table sugar, and it is widely used as a sweetener. Sucrose is actually composed of a glucose molecule and a fructose molecule bonded together. So we have a glucose and a fructose, both monosaccharides, bonded together. When a carbohydrate is only made up of 2 simple sugars, this is when we call it a disaccharide, because di means 2. So most plants actually don't make this sucrose, but the ones that do, such as sugarcane and sugar beets, are very important because that's where we get our table sugar. Sucrose is harvested naturally from these plants. So again, sucrose is a disaccharide because it has 2 monosaccharides put together via a chemical bond. And here's a little interesting note on cavities. So I'm sure all of you guys have been to the dentist before and maybe you've gotten a cavity or know someone that's gotten a cavity. Many people actually believe that sugar causes cavities. However, it's actually that when you have sugar on your teeth and you don't brush or you don't floss or take care of it, bacteria actually feeds off the sugar, and that's what actually causes the cavity. All right, here's another example of a disaccharide, which again means 2 sugars, that's found in milk. It's called lactose. So again, lactose is another example of a disaccharide, but this one is found in milk. You see we have 2 sugar molecules, 1, 2, and they're bonded together via chemical bond. Okay, so all mammals actually produce lactose for their offspring in the form of rich milk. And so this lactose is formed when you have a glucose molecule and another monosaccharide called a galactose molecule that form a chemical bond with one another. The only natural source of lactose is actually milk. So I'm sure some of you guys have also heard of someone being lactose intolerant, they might have trouble like eating ice cream or drinking milk without hurting their stomach and digestive system. And basically what that means is that there's a minor chemical structural detail that prevents these people from breaking down lactose. So that's why they get sick after eating foods that contain lactose. So they don't have this enzyme that actually can break the lactose down, so it just stays in their system, which gives them an upset stomach. Okay, so the summary of what we went over today for simple carbohydrates, we went over 2 different classes: monosaccharides, which is 1 sugar, disaccharides, which are 2 sugar molecules put together via chemical bond. And some examples of monosaccharides were glucose, fructose, and galactose. And some examples of disaccharides were sucrose and lactose. Again, remember, we're going to be going over in the next lesson more into detail, but simple carbohydrates, we can use them and they become they have different properties when they actually bond to one another to make more complex carbohydrates. The body converts proteins, fats, carbohydrates into glucose. Remember, that was that main monosaccharide that is present. And glucose is broken down in a series of reactions to produce that usable energy for cells, which we're going to call ATP. Okay, so again, simple carbohydrates are extremely important because they not only are building blocks of carbohydrates, but they're a source of energy because we use it and break it down in order to make our usable energy, which is called ATP. So here's some important vocabulary that you need to know. Carbohydrates, which remember is one of the 4 major classes of large organic molecules made from carbon, oxygen, as well as hydrogen. We have monosaccharides, which means one sugar. It's the building block of carbohydrates. We have glucose, which is that main monosaccharides. Deoxyribose, which is found in DNA. Ribose, which is a monosaccharide found in RNA. We have sucrose, which is a disaccharide, remember 2 sugars made up of glucose and fructose. We have disaccharides, which means 2 sugars, right? 2 monosaccharides bonded together. And lastly, we have lactose, which is another example of a disaccharides, meaning 2 sugars that is commonly found in milk. And the 2 sugars that make up lactose are galactose as well as glucose.